to live better and in peace, to see their lives go forward, to guarantee the future of their children. So whenever we have to talk about political education, we always have to emphasize that central point. So, comrades, the people of South Africa, we have to highlight something important about this day, the 26th of June. So despite it being historically relevant and important in the context of South Africa's politics, it is also important in terms of the global politics, because in the year 1945, the United Nations Charter was signed. So the United Nations Charter is a charter that got to establish the United Nations as a global organization for all nation states and countries in pursuit of peace and global peace, in pursuit of cooperation amongst all the nations of the world. Of significance is that when the United Nations Charter was signed on the 26th of June 1945, there were only 3 nation states or countries in the African continent that were considered to be independent and deserved some degree of participation in the United Nations process. And that was Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. Despite being under colonialism of a special type, or colonial settler colonialism of a colonial government, it was given the status of an independent nation. And the head of state at that time of a colonial South Africa was a Jan Smuts, who participated in the drafting and finalization of the United Nations Charter. And this is important to speak about, because when we later on speak about the reform of the United Nations, we will highlight the fact that it doesn't make sense that the foundational permanent members of the Security Council continue to be the permanent members of the Security Council in the United Nations, in the architecture that was designed due to the events and politics of the post-World War II dynamics as to who won the war, who was the ally of those that defeated Nazism. So we need to then deal with that issue when we then get to reflect later on that we have got more than 1 billion people in the world who are residing in the African continent but do not have any meaningful participation in the United Nations, which is supposed to be a representative body for all the people of the world. But today we are not talking about the United Nations. So just wanted to highlight that date so that later on when we talk about it, there's context as to why are we calling for the reform of the United Nations as Africans in the continent and Africans in the African diaspora. Now, we did highlight that today marks exactly 70 years since the adoption of the Freedom Charter. So the Freedom Charter is the clarion call. It is a summary of the aspirations of the people of South Africa, which was adopted by a gathering referred to as the Congress of the People in 1955 on the 26th of June in Kliptown. What led to the adoption of the Freedom Charter was due to the fact that for many years, since 1652 in terms of recorded history, although there were many attempts before 1652 to colonize South Africa, starting from the 1400s, but since 1652, South Africa got to experience the beginning of settler colonialism, where those who were supposed to be passing through the Cape as a stop-by point in their trade between Europe and part of the east of the world, in particular India, Indonesia, they used to stop by the Cape because there was no direct connection from Europe into the east. They had to necessarily pass through the they had to pass through the Cape as part of the stop-by when they were doing global trade with other parts of the world. But from 1652, South Africa got to experience settler colonialism, which mutated over time to take different forms and shapes. But whatever form and shape it took, it was defined fundamentally by the exclusion and suppression, oppression of the indigenous people who were found here in a country called South Africa. So majority of our people were subjected to wars of dispossession. Their land was taken, their animals were taken, everything else that belonged to the indigenous people were taken. And that did not happen without resistance. There are so many wars and battles of resistance against colonialism that took place. There are so many attempts to fight against colonialism that happened. But overall, the black majority, Africans in particular, who were found here in ownership and control of the land with their own systems, were ultimately conquered. We have to face the reality, South Africa, that since 1652, the conquest that occurred on our people is still a reality to this day, because the features of conquest is land dispossession, is wealth dispossession, is identity dispossession, is cultural dispossession, is cultural suppression, is social suppression, to the extent that we view ourselves as of lesser human beings as compared to those that came from outside as settler colonialists that got to dominate all over us. And you would know that after years of colonial suppression and settlement in this country we call South Africa today, the whites fought amongst themselves in the late 1800s, but they then reached a conclusion amongst themselves in the early 1900s, in 1902, that they must constitute a South African state that is going to exclude the black majority from meaningful political, economic, and social participation. That process led to the launch or inauguration of the Union of South Africa in the year 1910. So in the year 1910, the Union of South Africa was inaugurated as a country. And that, by the way, happened due to an act of parliament which was passed by the British Parliament in the year 1909, which was called the Union of South Africa Act. The Union of South Africa was a product of the unification of the colonial settlements of the Cape, which to this day is still the northern, eastern, and western Cape, of the Natal colony, which is constituted by majority of what is the province of KwaZulu-Natal, but also of Transvaal and the Orange River colony. In nominal terms, the Orange River colony, which is the Orange Free State or the Free State, and the Transvaal is mostly what is Gauteng, Limpopo, Northwest Mpumalanga. So those parts were understood to be under the Afrikaners, and then the Cape and Natal were under the British rule. But after the passing of the Union of South Africa Act of 1909 and the establishment of the Union of South Africa as an independent nation state, it then got to unify the four colonies to constitute the Union of South Africa. So South Africa was not that time referred to as the Republic of South Africa. It was called the Union of South Africa. They, of course, in their conclusion of such a deal, they got to subdivide the capitals as to where the capitals should be in South Africa. That is why you have got the legislative capital being Cape Town, you have Pretoria as the administrative capital, and you had Bloemfontein on behalf of the Orange River colony as the judicial capital. And in that negotiation, the Natal colony then negotiated the completion of a project in terms of what they had negotiated without being home to any of the capitals that were distributed in the so-called Union of South Africa. And as a result of the formation of the Union of South Africa, black people, Pixley Kaisaka Seme, led the process of saying that black people should organize themselves to constitute a resistance movement as a political party which will resist the colonial settlement in the Union of South Africa. This is very important before we give clearer context to the Freedom Charter. So Pixley Kaisaka Seme, who was in his early 30s, began actually to write about the unification of the progressive voices and all the traditional leaders, the clergy, and all black intellectuals to resist colonialism and apartheid. The processes that was led by Pixley Kaisaka Seme led to the formation of the South African Natives National Congress, which was launched on the 8th of January 1912 in Bloemfontein. It was later on renamed the African National Congress in the year 1923. But that did not stop the fact that the colonial government had agreed, the Afrikaners and the British had agreed amongst themselves that they are going to continue with oppression of the black majority and Africans in particular. They forced our people into waged labor because they introduced all sorts of taxes that our people must not be able to live subsistence lives without reliance on a wage so that they can pay the colonial government some taxes or levies that were demanded from them or face some degree of punishment or arrest if they did not do so. And the earlier methods of struggles of the South African Natives National Congress was to send deputations and delegations to the Queen and to the King in England to ask for the accommodation of some sections of the black society into the colonial government. That method of struggle did not bear anything. In 1913, they passed the apartheid colonial government, let's say the colonial government in context, passed the 1913 Land Act, which dispossessed majority of our people, the black populations, Africans in particular, of their land, and made it legislation now that the land belongs to the colonial settlers. And then our people were then subjected to the arid rural areas without meaningful participation and usage of South Africa's land. So whilst there was no political rights that were given to black people who constituted more than 80% of the population, in some instances even 90% of the population, black people were not allowed to participate in elections. They were not allowed to vote and be voted. They were not allowed to stand for government. But within themselves, white people were having elections after every 5 years. And until the year 1948, the winners of those white-only elections were predominantly the British descendants of colonial settlers. But in 1948, then under the leadership of a racist colonial settler called D.F. Malan, the Nationalist Party, which represented Afrikaner interests, won elections and began to institutionalize and make harsher the colonial rules that existed before. And part of what they got to do was to pass a law called the Group Areas Act. The Group Areas Act got to segregate people according to color, saying that black people must stay this side, colored people must stay this side, Indian people must stay this side, white people must have their own areas. But also got to introduce the whites-only beaches and whites-only amenities. There were certain things that were reserved for white people only under this Group Areas Act. And they also introduced something called the Population Registration Act, which then got to now solidify that is black, Indian, colored, and white with certain benefits reserved for white people only. So if you see on the images of apartheid, something that says whites only or no blacks allowed, Europeans only, was as a result of the laws that were passed by the Nationalist Party government, which had won elections in 1948. In 1950, they passed an act of parliament called the Suppression of Communism Act. But that Suppression of Communism Act was not suppression of communism, was a suppression of any resistance to apartheid. Anyone who criticized apartheid was considered a criminal. Anyone who got to stand up against apartheid was considered to be committing a felony, was considered to be of resistance to the apartheid system. And then they got to criminalize and arrest lots of people, including those who will just possess a document that would be advocating for change. As a result, the Communist Party of South Africa was banned in the year 1950. And the South African Natives National Congress, which by that time was now called the African National Congress, through the agitation that came with the earlier launch of the Congress Youth League in 1944. So the Congress Youth League was launched in 1944 with at the forefront with Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, Mxolisi Majumbuzi, A.P. Mda, Robert Sobukwe, Robert Risha, and a variety of other prominent leaders that got to agitate the direction of the ANC from being a peaceful organization into now a defiant organization, to the extent that even a defiance campaign was launched to resist apartheid. Now, the context of the Freedom Charter comes from now a proposal by one of the prominent leaders of the ANC called Professor Z.K. Mathews. So Professor Z.K. Mathews was a professor who was always contributing. He was once a president of the ANC in the Cape. And then he proposed in the year 1953 that there perhaps should be a charter that summarizes what those who are fighting for freedom should say is the way forward. And then in that perspective, he said that let us start the process of consulting other fighting organizations. So now, due to the Population Registration Acts, even the organizations that were constituted at that time to fight against apartheid had to be constituted alongside the apartheid racial lines, to the extent that the African National Congress was an organization for Africans only. And then there was an organization called the South African Indian Congress. There was an organization called the South African Congress of Democrats, which was for white people who were saying they're opposed and stand opposed to apartheid. And then there was an organization called the Colored People's Congress, which was for colored people who then said that they want to stand against apartheid. And in the overall, they then formed part of what got to be known as the Congress Alliance. And those were the ones who then got to associate with the process of saying, let us go to the ground and listen to our people with the aim of enacting or adopting a charter which will inspire our fighting spirit, and the manner in which we then table our demands as to what do we stand for, what kind of South Africa do we want to construct here. As a result of the proposal of Professor Z.K. Mathews, those who go to UNISA will know that the main hall in UNISA is named after Professor Z.K. Mathews. And for context, his son was called Joe Matthews. Joe Matthews led the ANC Youth League at some stage as a president, and he led in the Revolutionary Council during exile years. He is a father of the former Minister of International Relations, the former Minister of Education, Naledi Pandor. So it's people that you can still trace their history in terms of where they came from. So Z.K. Matthews is the grandfather of Naledi Pandor. So as a result of that proposal, a National Action Council was constituted of all these Congress alliance components that we spoke about: the African National Congress, the South African Indian Congress, the South African Congress of Democrats, the Colored People's Congress, but also later on got to be joined by the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACTU. So SACTU, if you were to trace the history of COSATU, COSATU is an evolution that came from the South African Congress of Trade Unions. And after the proposal of Z.K. Matthews in early 1954, and in early 1955, there was then a beginning of mass grassroots campaigns that were led by the National Action Council. They began a listening campaign and program. They said, let us go and listen to our people. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with political movements listening to the people. They said, let us go to the ground and listen to the people as to what do they want to see as freedom, what do they want to see as rights, what do they want to see as privileges that they must enjoy out of this country called South Africa. As a result, there was more than 50,000 volunteers who said that we were going to volunteer to go and collect what was called the freedom demands from townships, from rural areas, from factories, from farms, from everywhere. So the Freedom Charter is a result of a nationwide collection of freedom demands that came from different areas. And the demands that came from the different people and different constituencies were written in small pieces of paper. There was no social media at that time. It was not possible to send emails that time. So people will go and write in exercise books and informal documents and giving demands and receiving demands on the land, on education, on wages, and also on equality. And then there was also an establishment of the committees, organizing committees under the National Action Council, which were coordinating in the then 3 provinces of the Transvaal, of the Cape, of Natal, and the Orange Free State. They were coordinating and submitting all the demands that were given by the people in terms of what got to happen. And from the mid-1954, the year 1954, then the process of drafting the Freedom Charter began. And the drafting team included, again, Professor Z.K. Matthews. It included Ruth First. Ruth First will know, like if you read the history of Ruth First, she's one of the most outstanding revolutionaries that got to stand against apartheid, despite the fact that she could have conveniently benefited from apartheid because of the color of her skin. And the drafting process from 1954 and revisions and different meetings of the National Action Council took place. And then the date of the 25th and 26th of June 1955 was then identified as a date where a Congress will be convened, and that Congress was referred to as the Congress of the People. And you can see that the identification of a date that included the 26th of June was inspired by the fact that the United Nations Charter was also adopted on the 26th of June 1945. So then the 25th and 26th June were the dates where 3,000 representatives and delegates from all over South Africa met in Kliptown. So Kliptown is part of the southwestern townships of Johannesburg. So it's still there. It's largely an informal settlement. There's a monument that is built there to commemorate the 26th of June 1955. But that Congress in 1955 took place to then listen to the different demands and reports from the 4 provinces that existed in South Africa at that time, submissions from different sectors, and then the Freedom Charter was adopted on the 26th of June 1955. And despite the Congress of the People adopting the Freedom Charter, the separate organizations still had to go and discuss amongst themselves on whether they should adopt the Freedom Charter as their organizational perspectives. The Indian Congress, the Colored Congress, the Congress of Democrats, all of them had their own meetings to adopt the Freedom Charter. The ANC only adopted the Freedom Charter in 1956, but after heavy internal battles and ideological discussions in terms of what should happen, there were those who were opposed to the Freedom Charter within the African National Congress. That included the team led by Robert Sobukwe and A.P. Mda, that said that the first sentence in the Freedom Charter, we're going to speak about that now, the first sentence in the Freedom Charter that says South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, cannot be correct, because South Africa does not belong to all who live in it, black and white. It belongs to Africans and black people. The rest are visitors. So the component that was considered as Africanist opposed the Freedom Charter on the basis that it is accommodating of white colonial settlers as if they are owners of South Africa's land. That is an ideological debate that occurred vociferously within the structures of the African National Congress. But even within that context, there are those who were saying that this Freedom Charter is a communist document, because amongst its clauses, there's a clause that says the mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. So there was resistance from the right, led by a person who was part of the ANC leadership called J. Ngubane. And then there was a component that was saying this is too liberal. And then there was a middle ground which said that this is a proper expression of the ideals of the people of South Africa. But in 1956, the ANC adopted the Freedom Charter, and from there on, it became an elementary component of all ANC constitutions, including its membership declaration. All those people who joined the ANC, who have joined the ANC, have always committed to achieve the aims and objectives of the Freedom Charter. We're going to talk about that now in detail as to what are the aims and what are the charter commitments and promises and what are the ideals that were contained in the Freedom Charter. But one thing that is worth highlighting is that the Africanist component of the African National Congress believed that if the ANC adopts the Freedom Charter, there's a necessity to form a different organization. That is how the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, or the PAC, was founded under the leadership of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, to say that we cannot associate with the Freedom Charter that says that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. At formation, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania was far much more powerful, was a mobilizing force, was a clarion call to all the people of South Africa. The struggles that were led on the 21st of March in Sharpeville, 1960, were led by the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. Same activities happened in Langa and the whole of South Africa. Robert Sobukwe was a real threat to the apartheid system and government. They were much more fearful of Robert Sobukwe than any other leader. They were not afraid of Nelson Mandela. They were not afraid of Walter Sisulu, of Oliver Tambo, although they got later on to imprison them for what they said is terrorism. Now, that is one issue that we must highlight. Now, the other issue, which is an important development post the adoption of the Freedom Charter, was a trial that began in 1956 and it ran for 4 years. So the apartheid government said that this Freedom Charter, which was adopted in Kliptown and adopted by the separate organizations, is beginning to be a problem. It is a communist document, and they are therefore going to arrest all the people who are associating with the Freedom Charter. As a result, from 1956, there were 156 leaders of all these organizations that were arrested because they associated with the Freedom Charter. At that time, the president of the ANC was a James Moroka, who, when he was arrested, he organized his own lawyers and distanced himself from the Freedom Charter, distanced himself from those that he was arrested with. But they were later on, all of them, acquitted in 1961 in what was called as the Congress, in what was called the treason trial. But in the court proceedings of the treason trial, the prosecutors were taking out the Freedom Charter to say this document is Exhibit 1 to show that these people are communists, and this is a violation of the Suppression of Communism Act, which was passed in the year 1950. So that is basically what got to happen with the Freedom Charter. But what does the Freedom Charter say? What is this Freedom Charter that got people arrested? What is this Freedom Charter that became a rallying point of all the liberation forces? I must highlight, maybe before we get there, that when the United Democratic Front, UDF, was founded in 1983, it got to have affiliate organizations from all corners of South Africa. Many organizations, there is an estimation of anything between 400 to 700 different organizations that identified with the UDF. And their common thread and common program was the Freedom Charter. The other components that got to be founded and to join into the Congress movement, the Congress of South African Students, which is COSAS, the South African Students Congress, which is SASCO, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, the Congress of Traditional Leaders in South Africa, which is Contraleza, the South African Sports Congress, the South African Writers Congress, all the Congress formations that were constituted post the adoption of the Freedom Charter, they got to all of them adopt the Freedom Charter, meaning that it is the most uniting rallying point which got to unite all the freedom fighting forces for South Africa's liberation and freedom. And that is where we come from. Now we're going to talk about the Freedom Charter in details, but we need to highlight something very important about the Freedom Charter, that despite it being highly contested, it became the clarion call. It became the uniting perspective for a substantial majority of those who were fighting for freedom and emancipation. And we can correctly say that despite being opposed to it, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania was also a product of the Freedom Charter because it had ascribed to a much more radical version of how the struggle for emancipation should be pursued. And you would know that after the Sharpeville massacre on the 21st of March 1960, On the 8th of April 1960, the apartheid government banned all political organizations. So political organizations that stood opposed to apartheid, all of them were banned. They were not allowed to exist. And in the intervening period from the early 1960s, activism mostly shifted to students in institutions of higher learning. That is when they began to be the rise of the likes of Steve Biko to lead the South African Students Organization, which was a breakaway from an organization called NUSAS, which was the National Union of South African Students. And SASO, the South African Students Organization, gave birth to an organization called Black People's Convention, BPC, which was now a rallying point under the overall ideology of Black consciousness to be the mobilizing instrument amongst our people. And a distinct issue which we must highlight is not a diversion about the BPC, is that it was also involved in community projects on healthcare, on assisting our people with schools assistance programs, with a variety of social assistance programs that were led during that period. They also even got to launch something called the Zimele Trust under the guidance of the Steve Biko's BPC in that particular period. And 1976, June 16, was influenced by the Black Consciousness Movement. Those that associated with the Congress Alliance did not approve necessarily of what happened in June 16, 1976. But what they did after the June 16, 1976, they began to appreciate that students at pre-secondary level can be instruments of revolution, can be mobilized into a formidable force that can fight against apartheid. Hence, the process of launching the Congress of South African Students, COSAS, began, inspired by the courageous struggles and confrontation of apartheid of the June 16 generation that confronted apartheid under the leadership of Tsitsi Mashinini, Kgotsose Ahlula, and many other revolutionaries that got to play a role at that particular time. COSAS associated with the Freedom Charter from day zero, and that was launched in 1979. In 1983, there was a launch of a front, an organization, a proper revolutionary front anti-apartheid movement called the United Democratic Front. So the structure of the United Democratic Front meant that civic organizations and community organizations and organizations that existed in different sectors of society, in different areas, could affiliate to UDF as part of the broader mass democratic movement and anti-apartheid movement here in South Africa. And the UDF's overall and uniting component was the Freedom Charter. Part of those who belonged to the UDF as organizations was a prominent organization called the Port Elizabeth Black Civic Organization, PEBCO. It also included COSAS. COSAS was one of the largest affiliates of UDF. There was something also called the Federation of Transvaal Women. There were many trade unions that got to associate with UDF and a variety of different congresses, Soweto Youth Congress, Cape Youth Congress, a variety of Durban Youth Congress, and different areas, Eastern Youth Congress. They got to affiliate with the UDF as part of the rallying point, and their uniting factor was the Freedom Charter. So what is this Freedom Charter which we say got to unite all the fighting forces? What does it say? And why did it got to define South Africa's politics? It's adopted 70 years ago, not 50 years ago, 70 years ago, became the rallying point of all political struggles that happened in South Africa post-1955. What does it say? The Freedom Charter says that we, the people of South Africa, declare for all our country and the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people. The Freedom Charter says that our people have been robbed of their birthright to land, liberty, and peace by a form of government founded on injustice and inequality, and that our country will never be prosperous or free until our people live in brotherhood, enjoying equal rights and opportunities. It says that only a democratic state based on the will of the people can secure to all their birthright without distinction of color, race, sex, or belief. And then in the introduction, it says that we therefore, as the people of South Africa, black and white, together equals, countrymen and brothers, adopt this Freedom Charter. And we pledge ourselves to strive together, sparing neither strength nor courage, that the democratic change here set out will be won. Now, that is a broad introduction of the Freedom Charter, but the essence of it, in terms of what it says, it then has a section that says, the people shall govern, that everyone, because at that time, black people were not allowed to participate in elections, they were not allowed to participate as voters and those who get voted. And then it then says that the people shall govern, they must be allowed to participate in elections. I think maybe let us take it this way so that we don't spend a lot of time on this. Let's deal with major sections of the Freedom Charter and give a critical review now. That here is a struggle that was fought primarily and more essentially because of the Freedom Charter. And then political power is attained in 1994. Did the Freedom Charter ideals get to be achieved? I will read the exact parts of what the Freedom Charter says and then provide a critical review in between instead of reading the entire section and come back to do a review later. So we'll do it dynamically or dialectically in a way that will then begin to reveal that it is beyond evident, it is beyond reasonable that majority of the Freedom Charter objectives which were fought for, which got so many people exiled, killed, banned, like separated from their families. A clarion call that united South Africa did not get to become a government program or politics of South Africa, even when people had lost their lives. People had sacrificed for this Freedom Charter. On the people shall govern, it says that the people and every man and woman shall have the right to vote for and to stand as a candidate for all the bodies that make laws. Well, we can say that to some extent such is achieved, but you know that there's a very close relationship in South Africa today between money and electoral office. Those who seem to dominate elections, whether inside political parties or even in real elections, are those that have resources. So that objective as well is not giving the essence of what was intentioned. But also the people of South Africa are not governing. And this is demonstrated as well by the simple fact that in South Africa you have got more than 40 million adults, people who are above the age of 18 and are eligible to vote. In the past elections, there were less than 18 million people who voted. So more than 50% of eligible voters in South Africa are not participating in elections. They are not governing, they don't have a voice. Even the less than 18 million who vote, the only time they participate in determining government is on the day of elections. And after that, they are not consulted. There is no consensus sought from them as to what is to be done. A prime example that we got to even listen to from some of the senior church leaders in South Africa is after the 2024 general elections, there was no outright winner, and a team of very small politicians go and discuss by themselves. They don't go back to constituencies and say, now that you did not elect us to be government, what do you advise we do as political parties? They go and have elite discussions and constitute the so-called government of national unity to the exclusion of majority of our people, because they think that voting is an expropriation without compensation of the vote and the right to govern. Are the people of South Africa governing? We should ask that question. If the aim of the Freedom Charter that the people shall govern is being realized, are you governing wherever you are? Are you government wherever you are, or you have just voted for a government and do not have a say on what that government does? The other commitment of the Freedom Charter is that the all national groups shall have equal rights. Whilst the rights are written in the Bill of Rights in the Constitution of South Africa, in real terms, we do not have equal rights in South Africa. Those who are beneficiaries of the system of apartheid and colonialism continue to occupy the same position. There's nothing that has changed. So it means the Freedom Charter objective in that regard has not been realized. That section says that all apartheid laws and practices shall be set aside. Whilst apartheid laws have been set aside, apartheid practices in South Africa have not been set aside. There could have been abolition of political apartheid, but economic and social apartheid, shown by highest levels of inequality, super exploitation of the black majority and Africans in particular, and racism in farms, in workplaces, is still an apartheid practice which was not set aside, despite the fact that the Freedom Charter says such can be and will be set aside. The most important component of the Freedom Charter is the people shall share in the country's wealth. We speak today here in South Africa, the people are not sharing in South Africa's wealth. The white minority still has ownership of more than 80% of South Africa's land surface. They own almost all arable land. They are the only ones involved in meaningful, large-scale commercial agriculture. And black people are nothing but suppliers of cheap and easily disposable labor. That clause in the Freedom Charter will highlight says, the wealth of our country, the heritage of South Africans, shall be restored to the people. Such has not happened. The Freedom Charter says, the mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. There is no such a thing, despite the fact that there was an act of parliament passed in 2002 called the Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Act. But our people are not benefiting out of the mineral resources. If anything, the mineral resources are an instrument of impoverishment. They cause poverty. Go to the mining areas. Go to areas which have got abundance of natural resources. That is where the deepest levels of poverty is found, alongside the richness and wealth that is beneath our soil. It is not for the benefit and ownership of the people as a whole. The Freedom Charter says that the restrictions on land ownership on racial basis shall be ended and the land redivided amongst those who work it to banish famine and land hunger. We all know that such is not the case. The white minority, in terms of statistically proven data, still control more than 80% and own more than 80% of South Africa. Attempts to reverse that have always been suppressed successfully. The Freedom Charter says that the state shall help the peasants with implements, seed, tractors, and dams to save the soil and assist the tillers. There is no assistance of peasants, of farmers to till the land. There's nothing that is happening. We're not involved in meaningful, as black people, in meaningful agricultural produce and production. We're just consumers of finished food, which even comes from other parts of the world, because there's no assistance program that is there. And the Freedom Charter on the other clauses says, no one shall be imprisoned, deported, or restricted without a fair trial. No one shall be condemned by any order of government officials. We know that the criminal justice system in South Africa does not respect that principle of the Freedom Charter. It says the courts shall be representative of all the people. We're still a long way to see courts in South Africa that reflect the demographics of South Africa. The Freedom Charter says that all those who work shall be free to form trade unions, to elect their officers, and to make wage agreements with their employers. Of course, there is some degree of labor rights that are permitted to unions on what they can do and achieve. But in true assessment of the state of workers in South Africa, more than 70% of the employed labor force in South Africa fall in the category of the working poor, that they just get salaries to take them back to work and feed themselves. They cannot afford their own houses. They cannot afford their own transport. They cannot take their children to school. They cannot invest in any other thing. And what stands between them and absolute poverty is that monthly salary, which is just sustaining them to have food and go back to work on a daily basis. That is what we are dealing with. The Freedom Charter says that men and women of all races shall receive equal pay for equal work. That is not the case in South Africa today. Proper Stats SA reports illustrate that white males still earn far much higher than any other grouping and category in South Africa, even when they are performing similar jobs as everyone. The Freedom Charter says that there shall be a 40-hour working week, a national minimum wage, paid annual leave, and sick leave for all workers, and maternity leave on full pay for all working mothers. Those rights, although some partially achieved, majority of that has not been achieved for majority of workers in South Africa. The Freedom Charter says that the doors of learning and culture shall be opened for all. It says that the aim of education shall be to teach the youth to love their people and their culture and to honor human brotherhood, liberty, and peace. The doors of learning and culture are still not yet opened for all. The Freedom Charter emphatically says education shall be free, compulsory, universal, and equal for all children. And higher education and technical training shall be opened to all by means of state allowances and scholarships awarded on the basis of merit. Whilst there have been introduction of a loan scheme called the National Students Financial Aid Scheme to assist those that go to post-secondary level and training education system, there is a substantial number of South Africa who are denied an opportunity to pursue further education and training. A simple calculation of that is that the number of students that exit the secondary system annually exceeds 1 million annually. But the number of spaces available at post-secondary level and training spaces, whether it's TVET colleges, universities, and universities of technology, is almost always less than 300,000. And what then happens to the 700,000? There is no active program to integrate our people into the mainstream educational system. The Freedom Charter 70 years ago said that adult literacy shall be ended by a means of mass state education plan. We do not have such. It used to exist in the past, but it has been abolished in terms of how such should be handled. The Freedom Charter says that a preventive health scheme shall be run by the state. South Africa does not have a preventive health care system. If you want to know what is a preventive healthcare system, you must go and pay attention to the healthcare system of Cuba, where there is daily inspections of health problems in communities, health screening, health awareness. It's not just hospitals waiting for people to be terminally ill and want or try to assist them thereafter. Government proactively in Cuba takes initiative of checking if there are no minor elements and components of disease and contain such before it becomes a pandemic or a problem in society. The South African healthcare system is not even a healthcare system, it's a hospitalization system, which is not in line with the objectives and commitment of the Freedom Charter that we are dealing with. They are all who can go, all of us, and read the aims and objectives of the Freedom Charter, which we said all of us constitute the core of what people fought for. We can say here, comrades, ladies and gentlemen, the people of South Africa, that everyone else has been saying that they are fighting for the Freedom Charter. The African National Congress says that they are fighting for the Freedom Charter. But are they fighting for the Freedom Charter? Is what the ANC is in pursuit of, in government, in pursuit of the Freedom Charter objectives. People were killed, people were arrested, people were imprisoned, people were exiled because of this Freedom Charter. Is the ANC in pursuit of the Freedom Charter? The other organizations that came outside of the ANC, they all claim to be associating with the Freedom Charter. Do they demonstrate any capacity to could be associated with the Freedom Charter? That is why we stand here today to say that isn't there a need to sit back and speak amongst ourselves and reflect deeply as to what do we do to achieve the aims and objectives of the Freedom Charter. The process which we announced on the 19th of June 2025 was a process to say that we are willing to listen to the people of South Africa as to whether we should constitute either a political party or a political movement or a democratic front, which amongst other things must look into these objectives of the Freedom Charter. There is extremely profound inputs which thus far we have received via social media, we have received from the people that we got to meet and the people that we got to interact with. One of those profound inputs is to say that these member-based organizations might be a problem. Isn't there a space to constitute a democratic front like the UDF was constituted, where affiliate organizations come and join as organizations, not as one person, one membership, and one membership card? Because that makes the organizations weak and their leaders way too powerful. That for them to survive within organizations, they have to follow the dictates, even when irrational, of their leaders. South Africa, we are calling on all of us again that, inspired by the fighting spirit of those who fought for the Freedom Charter and fought within the confines of achieving the aims and objectives of the Freedom Charter, let us shape a new movement. The phenomena which we have introduced of recruiting volunteers from all over South Africa and putting structures for a national consultation process is not new with Maibuya. It's a process which we learn from those that came with the Freedom Charter. Before the Freedom Charter was adopted as a framework, as a perspective to inspire the struggle for freedom, it had 50,000 volunteers who went to the ground to look for freedom demands. That is why we now, as Maibuya consultation process, are in the process of identifying volunteers, and we will, during the course of this week, announce the process as to what is to be done. But one thing that we must all keep in mind and be patient about is that let us internalize and understand what is this struggle all about. It's not just about quick wins. There must be systematic and systemic changes that are brought about in society. And at the end of the day, the measurement of the impact of those can and will only be seen by how the lives of our people are changed. Everything else that we do as a political leader must be measured on the impact such has on the lives of our people. So we're calling on all of us to contribute to the Maibuya process. Let's continue to teach ourselves in terms of the Freedom Charter and the perspectives. I thought that those we want to read in deeper detail the actual documents and the processes that were followed in the drafting of the Freedom Charter, who said what, where, how the freedom demands were collected, the minutes of the National Action Committee. You must look for this compilation of books. I think there's about 5, if not 7 volumes. They are called From Protest to Challenge. So number 3, volume 3 of From Protest to Challenge gives a clearer perspective as to all the processes that were engaged in before the Freedom Charter was adopted. We will, of course, give the link to those who want to make follow-up as to where they can get the book. But ladies and gentlemen, the people of South Africa, let us continuously make political reflections and eliminate ourselves. Let us raise our levels of political consciousness and contribute to the discourse of political engagement in South Africa, and not just focus on the issues of now and just now. Let us deal with politics in context. Let's raise our levels of political consciousness. The struggle continues. Maibuye Africa. Africa Maibuye. Thank you very much.